Welcome to the Forecast, a Fortify Rise podcast.
So this study's goal was to look at evidence of the various forms of serious mental harm that have been affecting the Rohingya population in the refugee camps in Bangladesh. The data showed that almost two-thirds of the people interviewed reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Almost 90% reported symptoms of depression. So those rates are 3 or 4 times the rates that you would expect in any general population.
Hello and welcome back to the show. My name is Sipashai Kunuwong. I'm the communication specialist at Fortify Rights. On today's episode, we'll be discussing the new JOY study by Fortify Rights and the Lowenstein International Human Rights Clinic at Yale Law School. The study I'm talking about is called My Tears Could Make Us See. The study makes a claim that the Myanmar military's infliction of mental harm against the Rohingya, an ethnic minority group from Myanmar, is indeed an act of genocide. And it is my privilege and honor to welcome one of the co-authors of the study and clinical professor of human rights at Yale Law School, Professor Jim Silk. Thank you so much, Professor Jim, for taking your time to speak with us today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to be with you.
Can you tell us a bit about the study and what is this study about?
So the Genocide Convention defines genocide as committing any of several acts that are listed in the definition of genocide. Any of those acts that are, and I'll quote, committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Those acts include killing people, and that's what most people think about when they think of genocide, massive killing. But there are actually 4 other prohibited acts, in addition to killing, that can also destroy a protected group. So those are deliberately inflicting conditions of life that are calculated to destroy the group, imposing measures that are intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of one group to another group, and then the one that we were looking at, causing serious bodily or mental harm. So this study's goal was to look at evidence of the various forms of serious mental harm that have been affecting the Rohingya population in the refugee camps in Bangladesh, harms that were identified by the team of Rohingya researchers and that were documented in the earlier Fortify Rights report, The Torture in My Mind. So the data from that research showed that enormous percentages of the Rohingya population in the camps in Bangladesh had experienced things back in Rakhine State in Myanmar in 2016 and 2017, things like experiencing frequent gunfire, the burning, destruction of their villages, seeing dead bodies, and watching physical violence being committed against other people, including family members and friends. And I'm talking about more than 90% of the people interviewed in that study having experienced those kinds of traumatic events. The data showed that almost two-thirds of the people interviewed reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Almost 90% reported symptoms of depression, and more than 80% reported other forms of emotional distress, including high levels of anxiety. So those rates are 3 or 4 times the rates that you would expect in any general population.
How these, mental harm and the severe mental health conditions, can be determined as an act of genocide and lead to the destruction of the group.
Our team started with what I would say was a pretty complete and very carefully documented picture of serious and persistent mental harm inflicted on the Rohingya by the Myanmar armed forces and their allies during this period of persecution and attacks in 2016 and 2017, the persecution and attacks that drove Rohingya out of Myanmar and into Bangladesh. And since then, a million or so Rohingya refugees in those camps have suffered horrible and deteriorating conditions in the camps. Those are the findings upon which we based our legal analysis. And we did two things, really. We did legal analysis, but the team of students also did a pretty deep dive into I'd say mostly scholarship on the lasting effects of this kinds of mental harm. It hasn't been so long. We're talking about 7 or 8 years. So it's too early to know now how long these symptoms will last among the Rohingya population. But as I said, we looked at studies, and there are a lot of studies of survivors of other mass atrocities. Going back to the Holocaust, the Cambodia genocide, Rwanda, they show pretty clearly that these debilitating kinds of conditions of mental suffering often persist for many years after the original traumatic experience. They damage the ability of the survivors to lead anything like a normal, constructive life, and they often lead to long-term health problems, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, extraordinarily high rates of suicide. So these studies tend to show that these forms of mental suffering often even recur in the descendants of survivors of mass atrocities. Second generation, the children, the grandchildren of people who survived these kinds of atrocities. And then that was all then part of what we looked at when we tried to apply the understanding and of the law of genocide to the specific mental harm that the Rohingya now in the camps in Bangladesh have suffered. The study really found that the acts perpetrated against the Rohingya by Myanmar forces that caused massive, documented mental harm do meet the criteria for the Serious Mental Harm Act under the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention and also in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court.
Is it common and possible for, people to sue states or, genocide perpetrators for causing serious mental harm?
There have not been a lot of cases where there were judgments based on the infliction of mental harm. Courts and tribunals have kind of understandably focused on bodily harm, physical harm, and they've tended to understand mental harm almost exclusively in relation to physical harm. In other words, the kind of mental harm that can result from physical abuse, like torture or rape. What constitutes mental harm has been more difficult to define. Well, why is that? It isn't subject to the, fairly clear-cut and often even visual evidence and diagnosis like bodily harm. And now, to me, really quite remarkably, the International Court of Justice, which is a court that only deals with conflicts between states, has started to take on cases involving genocide. And I think your listeners and others may be familiar with the fact that the Gambia, a small country in West Africa, has brought a case against Myanmar for genocide. And then eventually, and to me in some ways most importantly, and I emphasize eventually, and I think very likely, there will be the potential for using the law of genocide, including this provision about inflicting mental harm in domestic courts or special tribunals in the country where these events occurred. So in this context, in Myanmar itself, the military junta will not be in power forever. And we've seen this in other parts of the world where having justice for atrocities like this in the short term has been impossible. But over the long term, when there's political change and stability, there's the potential then to hold people accountable. And in some ways, that's the part of this whole regime of international law around holding people accountable for the most serious crimes has the most hopeful potential.
Right. Now that this study has been done, I wonder what else is needed in terms of studying the impact of mental harm, but also to efforts to create justice or an accountability for genocide survivors.
So there are a couple of things that I hope do come out of this. One, not in the area of accountability. It's in the area, and I suppose this was more the focus of the earlier report, um, but continued study of the mental harm in the Rohingya population. And this is something that's important in the context of atrocities wherever we see them. Um, in Sudan now, in Gaza, we have to understand better the mental consequences of these kinds of atrocities. And we need to understand it better for two reasons, at least two reasons. One, so that we can provide, and when I say we, I mean the international community broadly, um, the relief agencies, the United Nations, everyone concerned, so it can provide the kind of mental health services and assistance that people need in order to be able to live decent lives. We tend to focus on things like food and shelter, and those obviously are important. But people's mental well-being is important as well, and that needs to become a more important part of the kinds of efforts to meet the needs of people in refugee camps, people who have suffered these kinds of atrocities. And we need to keep studying the longer-term mental effects and understand them better. And then I would say we need to continue in a very general way, when we're talking about this particular issue of mental harm, to push this as an issue in whatever tribunals are dealing with this. I'd say there's been a kind of reluctance on the part of these courts to view the infliction of mental harm as itself an act of genocide. As I said before, it's an understandable caution because it's hard to determine that mental harm has occurred or how serious it is. But we hope this study will go some way toward making it more viable to invoke the Mental Harm Act of the Genocide Convention in efforts to prove that genocide existed and to attribute responsibility to all those actors who are responsible for the genocide, including those who might not be responsible themselves for the direct killing of members of a group. I think the findings about serious mental harm will undoubtedly become part of the story before those tribunals, and it will contribute to, how do I say, a bigger picture that can support findings of genocide and crimes against humanity. And then even if those kinds of efforts fail to achieve convictions for these crimes, and I believe this very strongly, presenting the evidence in international courts, or someday I again believe in the domestic courts of Myanmar or special tribunals in Myanmar, just the ability to have formal processes, present this evidence, have people testifying in public legal setting, can itself bring some sense of justice to those who have suffered these atrocities.
Thank you so much, Professor Jim, and especially on a hopeful note, reminding us that our work ensuring accountability for the Rohingya community continues. And that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening. This has been The Forecast. See you next time.